Hi, everyone, and welcome back to the Smart Tea podcast, where we talk about the lives of scientists and innovators who shape our world. How are you, Aarati?
I'm great, Arpita. How are you?
I am so good. I have a new mic and a brand new laptop, and I've just had
Hooray!
so many technical difficulties over the last couple of weeks. So I'm moving up in the world. Hopefully, the audio quality is better and editing is faster, and I'm really excited to finally have a computer that works.
Yeah, having new technology, it just opens up a whole new world. I feel like whenever I get a new computer, it's just like, oh my gosh, this is the world I've been missing, like where everything runs perfectly and I don't have to fight with my keyboard.
You realize like all the things you've been putting up with when your computer doesn't work, they just become normal to you. And then you're like, well, life could be really nice.
Yeah, exactly. It's like life is a dream now. Everything is running so smoothly. It's beautiful. Yeah.
Totally agree. How are you? What's going on with you?
Okay, so I found another pop culture scientist reference. So I don't know if I told you, but my New Year's resolution for this year was to read more for pleasure
Nice.
because I used to love reading as a kid. I would get lost in books for hours. And then I don't know, it just kind of like petered off. Life got busy. YouTube happened, TikTok, like Instagram, all those things. And then I was like, I need to really start spending less time on my phone and go back to reading books. But I'd been out of the game for so long, like, I don't even know which authors I like anymore. And so
Yeah.
it's been fun so far. Last few months, I've just been kind of like picking up books at random at the library and bringing them home and being like, all right, let's see, if I like this. And I saw a lot of recommendations for an author named Brandon Sanderson, who's a fantasy writer.
Cool.
Apparently, he's huge and everyone's like in love with his books. So I was like, okay, great. I'm like 15 years late to this bandwagon, but let me see if I can climb aboard. So I started reading one of his first books called The Way of Kings. Um, and I am 200 pages into this 1,000 page book.
Oh my God. You really picked a
I
heavy
know.
hitter for your intro back into
I
reading
really did.
1,000 pages. Is this book like the size of my head?
It's yes, and it's part one of a trilogy,
Stop.
apparently.
So you're like, I haven't read in a while. Let me read 3,000 pages.
Yeah, pretty much. Well, we'll see. Like the nice thing about books is that I'm not committed to it. So if I hate it, I can always give up on it. But so far it's really good. I'm really enjoying it. But what really made me excited was, it's a fantasy book, so there's a lot of like, soldiers going into battle and all of that sort of thing. But there's also a lot of talk of like cleaning wounds and stuff. And one of the ways that they prevent infection is spreading the wounds with something called Lister's oil.
Wow, even in a fantasy book?
In a fantasy book, yeah. Like, it's just like someone did their research into
Yeah.
surgery and antiseptic practice. I am so impressed. And it's just so random. It's just in there. Like, you would never know if you
Right.
didn't know
It's
who
like,
Joseph Lister was. It just kind of sounds like this is another fantasy potion, something called Lister's oil that doesn't actually exist in the real world.
yeah, it's like subtle.
Yeah. And that would have flown right over my head if we hadn't done that episode, but it didn't. And I'm so excited. So,
That's amazing. I love that.
do you read a lot?
I do. I mostly just read on Libby on my Kindle, so I can borrow books from the library onto my Kindle, which is great.
Oh, how is your Kindle? I was wondering about that because part of the reason I wanted to get into reading books also was to cut down my screen time because I think it was really
Yeah.
affecting my sleep. The books don't have that blue light that shines in your eyes and mess with
Yeah,
your,
definitely.
with your brain and prevent you from going to sleep. Does a Kindle like help with that?
Yeah, I was a huge Kindle naysayer. I was like, I love physical books. Physical books are the best. And I still love physical books, but the Kindle, I don't know what magic it is, but it's definitely not a screen. Like it is muted. It definitely is much
Mhm.
more like a book. And I just love how portable it is. And I know that's the whole point. And that's so silly. But I find myself rather than going on social media, if I'm, on Muni or waiting in line somewhere, I end up reading my Kindle as opposed to being on my phone just because it's so portable.
That's so nice. Yeah, like, think about lugging around
Right.
a 1,000-page book.
Right.
Like,
Which,
it's, like, at least 5
yeah, I
pounds.
mean, most of my books are not 1,000 pages. I will just say that, but at least in Kindle form, you don't really notice it as much. And I read my Kindle every day before bed for like an hour, and it's definitely not blue light, which is nice.
Yeah, because I have noticed that I'm, like, sleeping better when I read. I still haven't completely kicked the habit of, like, looking at my phone
Oh,
right
I still
before I
do
go to
that.
sleep, so sometimes I'll get tired and then I'll look at my phone and mess up my sleep anyway. So,
Yeah, I
yeah, it's still work in
for sure.
progress,
I
but
do think the Kindle was really
yeah.
helpful though. There's these TikToks of people who have this like completely sloth Kindle setup, which I find aspirational, where they have a clamp to
Mhm.
hold the Kindle like in front of their face so they can lay down and the Kindle is just propped in front of them. And they use a Bluetooth remote to turn the page
Oh
so then
my
your
god.
arms are tucked in your bed
They have a
and then you just
Bluetooth
click it and go to
remote.
the next page. I actually got this for my sister for Christmas and she loves it. She doesn't have to pull her hands out and have her hands be cold. And she said it's the best thing. So I think I
Best
so I think I might
gift
have to get
ever.
one for
Yeah.
myself.
That sounds amazing. There is nothing worse than, like, trying to figure out how to
Yep.
sit in bed and stay warm, but also
And
have
then
to
your
turn the
fingers are
page.
cold.
It's like it's a
I
struggle.
understand.
Yeah, it's a struggle. Yeah. Great gift. That's a great gift.
Um, great. Should we dive into our story today?
Yes. So today's story is actually also a listener request. We got a message on our website from Rachel, and she wrote that she would love to hear about female mathematicians. And we are so not math people. We are biology and health people. I think the last time I took a math class was like well over a decade ago. So I don't know about
It's
you, but
probably even been longer. I honestly, this makes a lot of sense because Aarti texted me earlier this week and said that she was thinking a lot about the science and content because it was so complicated and wanting to get it right. And now that you say that it's math, this makes so
yes.
much more sense. Kudos to you. You're so brave for
Yes.
taking this on. And we're doing it for you, Rachel, wherever you are. We're doing this for you.
Yes, and if I get it wrong, I'm so sorry. I'm gonna try and do justice to this because I went into this very naively, I have to say, like, I was like, my first instinct was like, "Oh, we're not math people, I don't know," but then I was like, "Oh, but it's a listener request, I really wanna do it," and so I talked to my brother, who is a total nerd and loves math and physics, like, that's his fun time.
I'm just really glad that we have him as a resource. It's like friends of the pod. That's really what we.
Yeah, it is. He is, yeah, and so I figured, like, if anyone knew a good mathematician for me to do, it would be him, so I asked him, and he's like, "You should do Emmy Noether," and I'm like, "Okay, great," and I looked up her story just really briefly, and I was like, "Oh, wow, she has a really interesting story. This is great. Awesome." So I started researching her and, like, researching her story, writing it down, figuring it out, and then I actually started trying to get into what exactly it was that she was known for, and that's when my world kind of, like
That's when things took a left turn.
yes. I was like, "What have I gotten myself into?" And I was, like, trying to do test runs with my family and ask them if they were understanding what I was talking about, and it led to some very, like, energetic conversations with everyone saying, like, "No, don't explain it that way, and you have to explain it this way," and, I even talked to my cousin who is a physicist, and she helped me, so shout out to my cousin Vasu who helped me. But basically, there's a lot of people who are counting on me to get this right.
I'm so invested and I'm so excited and I can't wait to see how the story unfolds. I'm so ready.
Awesome. Her story really is amazing, so that's also part of the reason why I didn't want to give up. So today, we're going to be talking about Amelie Emmy Noether, who very early on just ended up ditching her first name and going by Emmy to those around her and on all of her publications. She was born on March 23rd, 1882, to a fairly well off Jewish family in the small town of Erlangen, Germany. She was the eldest child of Max Noether and Ida Amalia Kaufmann, And her father was a well known mathematician and lectured at the University of Erlangen. And so, naturally, because of this, Emmy and her three younger brothers all developed a strong interest in science and math.
That is so cute. I imagine her with like three little ducklings behind her.
Yeah, basically. And they're all just smart little geniuses, all of them. But Emmy was a girl. So, unlike her brothers who were able to just freely pursue their interests in science and math, it wasn't proper for her to do that
Mm,
because she was a lady. So, instead, she was taught more quote unquote womanly things like
mm.
cooking, cleaning, playing music, and dancing. But other than dancing, which she actually really did enjoy, the rest of what she was being taught wasn't very fulfilling to her. Overall, she was a happy child, very cheerful and friendly, but because she didn't really care about anything that she was being taught at school, she didn't really stand out as a particularly bright
Yeah.
student or anything. Her friends and teachers did notice how logical her thinking was and how quickly she was able to solve puzzles and brain teasers, but they didn't really take that to be anything serious. That was all just like, oh, she's good at solving, this little brain teaser that we have, but that's nothing practical.
Yeah, like not actually useful to life, like almost like she's good at games, basically. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So, after graduating from high school in the year 1900, she took the exam to be a language teacher for French and English at girls' schools, which I guess would have been a respectable career for a woman. And she passed with one of the highest possible scores. However, that same year, she decided instead to screw gender norms, and she was going to pursue a career in math no matter what anyone else said.
Love that.
So she decided to attend classes at the University of Erlangen, where her father taught. At the time, there were almost 1,000 students at the university, and only two of them were women.
Oh my God.
Yeah, I know. But as a woman, Emmy was not allowed to properly enroll and participate in the classes. She could only audit them, and only if she got permission from the professor who was teaching the class
Mhm.
first.
So she wasn't actually even taking the classes for credit or having them count towards a degree or anything
Yeah.
like that. She was just watching, basically, like sitting in.
Well, I'm not 100% sure because she was able to take the graduation exam. So I think she did end up getting some sort of degree, but she wasn't able to like participate. So I'm not sure where they drew that line.
Okay, somewhere in the middle.
Yeah. But she fully leveraged the fact that her father was a well respected math teacher at that university. So, like, getting permission to sit in on classes and participate wasn't really too much of an issue for her.
Yeah, she had them in a little bit.
Yeah, exactly. Like, my dad works here and he's well respected too. So after 3 years, she did take the graduation exam and passed with flying colors. But that didn't really mean much for her, as I said, because she's a woman. So it doesn't open any doors for her in terms of higher education or jobs or anything. She couldn't really do anything with the fact that she passed this graduation exam. So she spent the winter semester between 1903 and 1904 attending more math lectures at the University of Göttingen. Here she met and attended lectures from two very important mathematicians, Max Klein and David Hilbert, and they'll pop up in a minute, so I just wanted to mention them here. In the spring of 1904, the German government issued a decree that women would be allowed to enroll properly at any university within the German Empire. So Emmy went straight back to the University of Erlangen to pursue her PhD in math. She worked under the supervision of Paul Gordon, and in 1907, she graduated and published her thesis work entitled On Complete Systems of Invariance for Ternary Biquadratic Forms.
Okay, pause.
I don't know. Don't ask.
Okay.
I honestly I honestly have no idea what that means. I did not even try to figure it out.
I legitimately don't know what a single word that you just said was.
So all I know is that it has something to do with invariant theory, which is a branch of abstract algebra that she specialized in.
Okay.
And later on, one of those professors, David Hilbert, that she met, apparently worked out a better approach for what she had done during her PhD. And when she was asked a question about it many years later, Emmy basically was like, "Oh, that work that I did back then for my PhD was total crap. I've forgotten all about it, so I can't really even try to explain it to you because it sucked."
So
So
this isn't even the complicated math. We haven't even got there.
no,
Okay, okay,
no.
okay.
Yeah. Yeah. So yeah, because I didn't even try. Like, once I read that she was like, "Oh, that was total crap. I've forgotten all about it." I'm like, "Okay, so then it's not important." So, the more I can spare my brain cells,
Okay,
the
all
better.
right. Speeding past that. So she did her PhD, math, math, math.
Yeah. So, but I just wanna clarify that invariant theory is not crap. Just the work that she did in that was.
Yeah, yeah. Her PhD wasn't crap. It was improved upon by another scientist.
Yeah, and she became an expert in invariant theory. Okay, so now Emmy has her PhD, but once again, she's in this position where there's nothing she can do with it. Like, apparently, the government said it was okay for women to study at universities, but not to hold a professorship or hold any kind of official position.
Weird.
So, for the next 7 years, she taught at the University of Erlangen's Math Institute without pay.
7 years she taught without pay. I wonder what other people thought about this. Like if she was trying to be a lady or she was taught to be a lady and now she's gotten a
Mhm.
PhD, she doesn't really have skills that would make her, like she doesn't have woman skills. I can't think of
Yeah.
a better way to say that.
Yes.
It's like basically her skill set is not for
Yeah.
a woman of society or whatever. I'm like, what's my Bridgerton vocabulary right now?
Yeah, it's not
Yeah,
proper. What are you
exactly. So, like,
doing?
what
Yeah, like,
did
it's not proper ladylike
I guess,
behavior.
like, what was her position in the world?
You know what? Like, a theme throughout this is she doesn't really care what other people thought about her. She just loved math and she was gonna do it. And she fully took advantage of the fact that her family was well off, so she
Yeah.
didn't need the money. So she didn't have to worry about that aspect of it. She could just continue doing what she wanted to do, basically. And this also meant that she was able to stay at Erlangen and continue to study math, work on invariant theory, and stay close to her family. So around this time, her father's health was starting to decline. And so when he was too sick to lecture, she would fill in for him as a substitute.
Oh,
So during this time, her old professor, Paul Gordon, retired, and his successor, Ernest Fisher, became Emmy's friend, mentor, and a major influence on her life. They would spend hours discussing lectures that they had attended, and even though they both lived in Erlangen and they saw each other all the time at the university, there are still existing postcards between the two of them where they're just sending each other algebra equations and their thoughts on math. Like, they had just thought of something and they couldn't wait to share it with the other person, so they just, like, wrote a postcard and dropped it in the mail and sent it to them.
oh my gosh, that's, like, actually adorable.
And all it is math. It's just, like, math scribblings on the back of this postcard.
I love it. It's, like, kinda like old-timey texting. It's like, I thought of something and I wanted to share it with you.
Yeah, and I was just picturing, like, the postman's face, like, looking at the postcard being like, "What the heck is this?" But she credited him with really shifting her way of thinking in a way that made her big breakthrough and what she's known for possible. So, let's get into that. Now it's 1915, Emmy is 33, and something huge happens. Albert Einstein drops his theory of
Mm,
general relativity. So basically, this was a brand new mathematical description of gravity. For nearly 200 years, scientists had been using Isaac
right.
Newton's laws of physics, which stated that gravity was a force exerted between two objects that was directly related to the mass or the amount of matter that those two objects had and the distance between them.
Okay.
And this was great for most things that people could observe and measure at the time. Like, we all know Newton's famous apple falling on his head. So the apple from a tree falls down to the ground because the earth has a lot more mass than the apple. And so it's pulling the apple down towards it, right?
Right.
So Newton's laws more or less explained things like why the moon stays in orbit around the earth and why planets orbit around the sun. But there were things that his laws did not explain. For example, I didn't know this, but apparently the planet Mercury has kind of a funky orbit that no one was really able to explain.
Is it an ellipse? Is that why?
It is an ellipse, but then it also isn't like a constant ellipse. It kind of like wiggles around the sun.
Oh, I actually didn't know that, but
Yeah.
yeah.
It just kind of like wiggles around the sun. And yeah, no one could really explain it. And Newton's laws didn't explain it either. And so by the time Einstein rolled around 200 years later, physicists were starting to study super tiny, fast things like light
Oh, yeah.
particles and atoms. And Newton's laws weren't really applicable to these things that were moving faster than the speed of light or had no measurable mass.
So you're like moving beyond things that you would consider visible or things that we like interact with like on a daily basis. So like the apple, for example, or the moon, or like
Yeah.
things that we are able to see and for the most part touch. But now we're moving on into things that are moving so fast and are smaller than we're able to see with our eyes.
Yeah, and if Newton is saying, like, gravity is this thing between 2 objects that have masses, and you're like, "Well, what about light
No
particles that have
mass.
no mass?" It's like, what do you do with that? So, Newton's theories assumed that space and time were fixed constants. So, physicists were working under the impression that you can't bend space and time will always move forward at a constant rate. And Albert Einstein comes in and basically says, not necessarily. Einstein instead hypothesized that there was this thing called space time that we all exist in. So, just like a fish exists in water that's all around it, we all exist in space time, and everything exists in space time, planets, stars, like everything. And space time can actually bend or contort based on the mass and energy that exists in the system. So, a really classic way that I found to picture this is the ball and trampoline analogy. So, you imagine you have a large trampoline, and that trampoline represents space time. And then you place a really big, heavy bowling ball, which represents the sun, in the middle of the trampoline, and that'll cause it to stretch and dip downwards. And that's basically how the sun causes gravity,
Right.
right? So if you place something now at the edge of the trampoline, it'll kind of be pulled down towards the bowling ball, the same way the sun kind of pulls everything in towards it. Um, and the way that the trampoline is stretching and contorting down into the bowling ball is how space time contorts and bends in.
That makes sense. So it's no longer a fixed constant. It's something that is able to bend and roll around something that also has mass. So that's interesting.
Yeah, exactly. And then each of our planets have their own smaller gravitational pulls. So they would all form their own smaller dips or contortions in the space time trampoline. So that's kind of what's happening. That example's in 2D. Obviously, we're living
Yeah.
in 3D. But in essence, Newton was sort of rightish. But when it came to studying light or tiny particles, Einstein's equations were a lot more reliable. But of course, it's new. And so universities all over the world are now scrambling to test it and see if it holds up to mathematical and physics experiments. And overall, it held up really well. And it also explained things that scientists had observed but had not had answers to, like Mercury's weird
Mm.
orbit. It explained
Hmm.
that. It also explained things like why astronomers had observed that light seemed to bend around stars. They had observed that phenomenon and they're like, wait, I thought light always moved in a straight line. How come it's seeming to bend? And Einstein's math equations showed why.
What a like crazy thing to discover though. Like you just well, first of all, space time existing on its own is nutso. And then
Yes.
also being able to be like, this thing bends. Like what a mind trip. Like
Yeah,
you're
like
yeah,
space. Like the space between me and the wall is actually bendable. Like you can contort
like
that.
that is just a crazy train of thought to come up with in the
Yeah.
first place, and then to also then be able to have math to back it up is just insane and
Yes.
incredible. But continue. So like now you're able to explain all these phenomena that were observed.
Yeah. You're able to explain all of this, and you're able to explain where gravity comes from in the first place. Like, it's not this like invisible nebulous force that just kind of exists between two
Right.
objects. It's like, oh, it's coming because of the bend and contortions in space time, obviously. But Max Klein and David Hilbert at the University of Göttingen were looking at Einstein's theory and they hit a snag. They were like, wait a minute. So, according to Einstein, mass can curve space-time, but also according to Einstein, mass and energy are interchangeable. And that's the famous equation E equals mc
Mhm.
squared. So that's energy equals mass times the speed of light squared. So those two are kind of equivalent in a sense. And so they were like, wait a minute. So if mass can curve space time, that must mean energy can also curve space time. But that would break the laws of the conservation of energy, because if energy can curve space time and space time contains energy, then space time would curve in upon itself. And that's weird. That shouldn't happen. That's problematic.
Just to break that down. So if mass and energy are
Yeah.
interchangeable, and we know that mass can bend space-time because of the trampoline analogy, and now we are thinking about energy, but space-time also has energy. So then if we are
Yeah.
saying that energy bends energy, now you don't have a finite amount of energy, which is the conversation.
Well, so we're saying that if energy can bend space time, and we know that space time contains energy, then space time would bend space time. Like space time would bend
I see.
itself, which is clearly not happening. But according to Einstein's equations, it would be happening. And so they kind of hit this weird paradox. They're like, something's wrong here.
It's almost like you're in a carnival with all the mirrors and they're all just like in and on themselves. It's like that, where it's like, well, this is bending itself, it's bending itself, it's bending itself.
Yeah,
Okay.
exactly. They're
And they're
like,
like, that is weird.
the math isn't mathing.
Got it. Okay.
Like something's
I'm
yeah,
following.
something's wrong here. And they asked Einstein about it and he was just kind of like, yeah, that's weird. I don't know. Like, I don't know what to
Keep that to yourself.
He's like, I know I'm right, but I don't know how to explain that thing that you just found. Max Klein and David Hilbert are trying to figure this out, and they realized that what they really needed was a specialist in invariant theory. So
Nice.
they decide to try and recruit Emmy to join them as a faculty member at the University of Göttingen. However, the other faculty members were not happy about this. World War I was underway, and one of the faculty members apparently said, "What will our soldiers think when they return to the university and find that they are required to learn at the feet of a woman?"
That's the problem.
Yeah, that's the problem.
Also, what if they don't go to college? That doesn't even, that's such a stretch. Like, they might come back from war,
Yeah,
and then they might want to go to college, and then there might be a woman.
where there's all this blood and destruction and death, and then they have a problem with the woman teaching them.
Yeah, that feels like a stretch for sure.
But David Hilbert had a pretty good response. He was said, "I do not see that the sex of the candidate is an argument against her admission. After all, we are a university, not a bathhouse." So I was
Love
like, good
that.
job. Pretty good.
we love an early feminist.
Yes. So they really fought for her, but unfortunately, they were not able to get her an official position. But Emmy didn't really care about that. She had her eyes on the bigger picture. She didn't care about titles and credentials. And again, she didn't need the money. So Emmy went to Göttingen anyway as an unpaid guest lecturer. And when she got there, she basically took one look at this paradox that Hilbert and Klein were struggling with and went, "Oh, that's not a problem at all. You guys are just thinking too small." And she like solved it immediately. And
What?
yeah,
This feels like a sitcom. She's just
I
like,
know.
just shows up with her like little whiteboard and she just like scribbles all over it and she goes, done.
Yeah, exactly. That's basically like what she did. And yeah, so like she figured this out in probably less time than it's going to take me to explain it, but just
Like,
immediately solved.
she's like,
Yeah.
got it.
This is not
Too
a
easy.
problem.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Next.
Yeah, too easy. Next. Yeah.
So, wait, sorry. Actually, though, is this like hours or like days? What is the time frame that we're talking?
Well, I know she came to University of Göttingen in 1915 and she solved this in 1915. So we're definitely talking less than a year. But all the sources that I read were like she pretty much immediately was like, this is not a problem at all, you guys. This is not a paradox. You guys aren't, let me show you why you're wrong. Okay.
This is just such good energy. Okay.
So in solving this paradox, she came up with what she is actually most famous for, which is called Noether's theorem. Okay, so we're going to try to explain Noether's theorem. So Noether's theorem, and this is straight from Wikipedia, says that every continuous symmetry of the action of a physical system with conservative forces has a corresponding conservation law. Got it?
Totally. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, now you know why when I first started looking her up, I was like, crap. What what did I get myself
I
into?
think I had you in the first half, and then after that, I was like, I think my eyes glazed over. So
So we're gonna try to explain it. So the two big ideas that are linked in Noether's theorem are symmetry and conservation laws. So let's first look at symmetry. So commonly we think of something as symmetrical if you change something about it and it looks the same. So for example, humans are symmetrical because if you take our left side and mirror it, it looks like our
Mhm.
right side. And the same way, like a flower that has 6 petals is symmetrical because you can rotate it in increments of 60 degrees and it'll still
Right.
look the same. In physics, two systems are called symmetrical if you change something and they still act the same way. So, for example, if you imagine you're in outer space and there's absolutely nothing around you, there's no planets, no stars, no friction, no wind, no external forces of any kind. You're just floating around empty space all around you, and you throw a ball. What happens to the ball? It'll leave your hand at a certain direction and speed, and it'll just keep on traveling that way forever. It'll just keep on going because there's no other external forces acting on it, right?
I see. Okay.
So it'll just keep going in that direction. So you can look at it 1 inch after it left your hand, and it'll be doing exactly the same thing 1 foot later, 2 feet later, a mile later, 1,000 light years later. It'll still be going in the same direction at the same speed no matter where you look at it along the trajectory.
Okay.
You can say that the ball is a system that has translational symmetry. That is, you can observe the ball in different places, and all the forces acting on it will always be the same.
So in this case, symmetry. Can you say the definition of symmetry again?
The definition of
Yeah.
symmetry in physics is that if you change something, it will still be acting the same way. It'll still look the same. So, in this case, with the ball example, if you look at it in different places along its trajectory,
I see.
the
Okay.
same forces are still working on it. And because of that, it's still moving in the same direction at the same speed.
And then the thing that you're changing is where you're looking at it along the trajectory.
Yeah, the different places. So, Noether's theorem says that translational symmetry is linked to the conservation of linear momentum. So, when you look at the ball in different places, its linear momentum will be
Okay.
conserved. Okay, so now what happens if you do the exact same thing on Earth, right? So, you throw the ball just like you did in space, except now when you look at the ball in different places along its trajectory, it's doing
Right.
different things, right? So, when the ball leaves your hand, like 1 inch after it's left your hand, it's going to be moving kind of horizontally away from you at a certain speed. But then if you look at it when it's 1 foot away from you, now it's moving faster than it was before and it's changed directions. It's getting pulled downwards, it's
Right.
moving down. In space, like it would have continued to move straight and keep moving away from you at the same speed, but now it's actually falling downwards. When it's 2 feet away from you, the ball is falling downwards even faster. And at some point, it'll hit the ground and it'll stop moving entirely. So if you're only looking at the ball, you might be confused. And this is a dumb example. So, like, bear with me, or a simple example. But in this case, it looks like linear momentum is not being conserved, right? The ball starts out at a certain speed, it gets faster, it changes direction, and then it stops. And according to Noether's theorem, that's because the ball's motion is no longer translationally symmetric. You are missing something. You are missing some external factor that is acting on the ball to make it move that way. And like I said, this is a really obvious, simple example, but the thing that you're missing is the earth,
Mhm.
right? Once you take into account the earth and you look at the ball and the earth together, and you see what's happening then. In that case, when you look at the ball when it's 1 inch away from your hand, it's farther away from the earth. And then when you look at it 1 foot away from your hand, it's moved downwards. So now it's closer to the earth, right? And at some point, it'll
Right.
actually hit the earth. So the ball is no longer translationally symmetric because the distance between the ball and the earth is changing. And that's why the linear momentum of the ball is changing.
I kind of get it. I think I kind of get it. So,
Yeah.
if you take into account the fact that the Earth is acting on the ball, then linear momentum is
Yeah.
conserved.
Yes.
Because basically, what she's saying is it is conserved as long as you are taking everything into account. And in the version where you're just looking at the ball moving through the air on Earth, you are not taking into account the Earth. So it appears to not be conserved. But once you take into account
Yes.
all the things that are acting on it, including the Earth, then you do see that it is indeed conserved.
Yeah, so you're able to restore translational symmetry if you include the Earth and its gravitational forces on the ball in your system. So
I
you have a
see.
system now that has two parts. It has the ball
Okay.
and the Earth. And so now when you run your calculations again, linear momentum is indeed conserved because everything's accounted for. The ball is getting pulled towards the Earth, and the Earth is actually moving just a teeny tiny little bit towards the ball.
Right.
And that is the conservation of linear momentum.
Okay, this makes sense. So when you're thinking about your system in physics, you would think about all the forces that are acting upon an object. And so you think about like a train or something, and it's like, oh, there's like the wheels on the track, and there's friction there, and then there's wind, and then there's like all these different things. And so you're
Yeah.
thinking about a system. And then in space, it's a vacuum because there are no forces
Yeah.
acting upon an object,
Yeah.
which is why you're able to have this symmetry, right?
Yes. Yeah. That's why linear momentum will be conserved because there's no external forces.
Right. And then if you're thinking about it on Earth, if your system does not include the Earth and its gravitational pull, it will not work because you're not taking into account all of the components of this system.
It'll look like linear
Is
momentum is
not
not being
conserved. Okay.
conserved. Yeah. Yeah. It'll look a bit weird. But now if you take into account the ball and the earth, you can move that entire system, the ball and the earth, to different places and everything will work out fine. And that is actually what's happening, right? Our earth is orbiting the sun, so we are in different places in space all the time. And yet, when we throw a ball on Earth, we can predict that linear momentum will be conserved because we are taking into account the ball and the Earth. So, no matter what point we are in space around the sun, we can say that linear momentum will be conserved because we have established translational symmetry in our system.
Got it. And the system is inclusive of all of these things that we've just discussed.
Yes, exactly. That that was a simple example.
I
That was a simple example.
feel like I maybe 40% get it, which is pretty good, I feel
Yeah,
like.
but it's really good. Like, you don't understand the amount of arguments and, like, the amount of work that I put into making this sort of
I
understandable,
believe
and
you.
then my brother coming in and just ripping it apart and saying, "No, you're completely wrong." I'm just like, "What is happening?" I still feel like at the end of this episode, he's gonna listen to it and be like, "You got it wrong." Like, "How? How did I get it wrong?" I'm really hoping it's not the case. But this was like the simplest way I could boil it down, I think, and what it really showed the power of Noether's theorem here is that it helps you see if you're taking everything into account when you are talking about very complex systems. So we were talking about a ball and then a ball and the earth. But when things get more complicated than that, which they do very quickly in physics, Noether's theorem helps you see if you're taking everything into account. So in the example with the ball in space, as long as there was nothing around to influence the ball by itself was a translationally symmetric system.
Uh-huh.
But once you move the ball to Earth, if you just look at the ball, you lose that symmetry,
Yep.
right? So you have to include the Earth in your system, and then everything is accounted for and the system is translationally symmetric again.
Yep.
And Noether's theorem lets us say with certainty that the laws of conservation linear momentum will hold true in that case. So it kind of like lets you know if you're missing something, basically.
Got it. That is very useful.
Yes. And there are also different symmetries a system can have. So Noether's theorem not only proved that translational symmetry is linked to the conservation of linear momentum, but she also showed that rotational symmetry is linked to the conservation of angular momentum. And so that means that you can rotate your system and still see the same thing. So that's more akin to throwing the ball in different places on Earth. Like if you throw the ball here in California, or you throw it in India, or you throw it in Antarctica, you can still predict the angular momentum of the system will be conserved.
I see. So it doesn't matter where on the sphere you still have rotationals. Okay, I
Yes.
understand.
Yeah, as you have rotational symmetry, then we can say something about the angular momentum. We can say angular momentum is conserved. And she also showed that temporal symmetry or symmetry over time is linked to the conservation of energy. So that's if you throw the ball today or tomorrow or 10 years from now, the energy of the system will still be the same.
Do we not know that before?
So we didn't have a mathematical proof for that before. We couldn't say that
Okay.
with like complete certainty. Um and so it came to Einstein's theory. Emmy basically said that if the conservation of energy laws appear to be broken, then you haven't included everything you need to in your system. Somewhere along the way in your calculations, David Hilbert and Max Klein had lost temporal symmetry. And once they figured out whatever it was that was causing them to lose temporal symmetry and added that back into their calculations, they were able to explain why it seemed like the law of energy of conservation was being violated, and they were able to resolve the paradox and fix their own mistake, basically.
Got it. So it's like not like a sanity check, but she's basically creating a way to check your work almost. So it's like you're able to account for all of these things because you're using her principle to ensure that you have symmetry in all of these different dimensions.
In the case of Einstein's paradox, yes, but physicists later were able to use this because if they're able to establish an underlying symmetry in whatever experiment or problem that they're trying to figure out, then they can use the laws of conservation of momentum or energy to figure out how their system should behave because they've established this underlying symmetry. So it's useful in kind of studying other things too. So resolving the paradox that was seeming to arise in Einstein's theory, that was just kind of like a side effect of the actual
Okay.
power of her theorem.
Okay.
Yeah.
But it wasn't necessarily the sole use.
Oh, not at all. Not at all. So Emmy proved her theorem in 1915, which was the same year she got into Göttingen, and she published it in 1918, and it fundamentally changed how physicists approached their research. So now they could look for these types of symmetries in their experiments, and if they were able to establish symmetry, they could use the conservation laws freely to solve problems. So afterwards, scientists found symmetries in other branches of physics, like quantum field theory. And when you start to get into things like particle physics and quantum physics, the link between symmetries and conservation laws is huge because before that, physicists didn't have a generalizable rule that they could apply to any situation and predict whether the conservation laws would hold true or not. So when Emmy showed that these conservation laws are rooted in symmetries, it allowed kind of a better understanding in all branches of physics and led to developments of things like semiconductors and even the Higgs boson particle in
Wow.
2012.
That's
So
amazing.
it's it's huge. It's like this huge underlying theorem that physics and math people use all the time.
So if we had to think about maybe like a very big picture way of thinking about it. So it's maybe not a sanity check or some kind of quote unquote checklist to make sure that symmetry exists in
Mhm.
your system. That was almost a
Yeah.
like a byproduct of finding this because they were just thinking about that specific problem at the time. But then making this so much
Yes.
bigger, it's almost a different lens through which physics problems are viewed because it's taking into account a lot
Yeah.
of these different things. So it's almost like she's like shifted perspectives through this theorem as opposed to creating a checklist. What I
Yeah,
originally said.
absolutely.
Okay, does that seem right?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I think that's much more accurate. It's really allowing you to predict if you can use these laws of conservation. And I actually watched some videos where people said like, you know, it's almost like magic. Like if they could establish some underlying symmetry, it's like everything would fall into place and they could do all these kinds of things that they wouldn't have been able to do otherwise.
So establishing symmetry is a good thing to do when you're trying to start thinking about a physics problem. Is like trying to understand symmetry
Yeah.
within all of these different dimensions, like temporal symmetry or translational symmetry or angular.
Yes.
That's like a
Yeah, it makes things so much easier.
understood.
Yeah,
Okay, I see.
it's so important.
I'm actually thinking about this also because, like, it feels like maybe this is just the world that I live in, but it feels like a lot of physics discoveries and things that happen in space and like quantum theory and all of these things. Like, I feel like we hear about them when they're shiny, like the James Webb telescope or something like that, but we don't actually get to hear all of the
Mhm.
things and steps that come up leading up to it. And I should find
Yeah.
what it was, but I listened to a different podcast with a science communicator, and she is also a physicist. And she talks about how it's very difficult to get the public to understand what they're doing because it is so difficult for even physicists to like conceptualize and to put things into words. And the
Yes.
reason they're using math is because explaining it in words is so difficult to do. And that's why they
It's
use math.
so hard.
And so it's not for a lack of, understanding it or whatever, but it's difficult for even these people who have done this for a living for so long to put it
Yeah.
into words for number one, and then put it into words that lay people can understand, which is why I think a lot of this stuff doesn't really get talked about that much, or we just don't have like a context for it as much.
Yeah, absolutely, because even like I said, even the ball in space
Yeah.
versus the ball on Earth, like, I can't explain to you how many iterations of that scenario we went under, and like, even up till yesterday, I was still saying it wrong, and I'm like, "How complicated can this be? It's a ball in space, and then it's a ball on Earth." Okay, I think we're almost done with the math. So, at the end of World War I, the attitude towards women's rights in general were starting to become more progressive. But despite this, and despite the major breakthrough that Emmy had just made, she still wasn't really getting the recognition that she deserved.
Classic.
To give lectures, she technically had to do so under David Hilbert's name. So, to get around the system, they would advertise her lectures as David Hilbert with guest lecturer or assisted by Emmy Noether. And then David Hilbert would quote unquote forget to show up to his lecture so that Emmy could just give the lecture on her
He
own.
really sounds like an ally. I love it.
It took the university 3 years to allow her to take an exam for which she would become eligible for tenure. But even though she was successful, it took another full year for her to get a position that actually paid her a tiny salary. But again, Emmy didn't really let any of this phase her. She continued to work in abstract algebra, and in 1921, she published a paper called Ideal Theory in Ringberechen, which gave rise to the term Noetherian ring and was described as revolutionary by mathematics. And again, like, I did not go into this. I was just like, I can't.
Yeah, let's cut our losses here.
I can also like but one interesting thing I did find about it is that actually today many universities call the clubs and support groups that they have on campus that support women and minorities studying math the Noetherian ring.
Oh,
So it's like their club name.
yeah.
Emmy was very enthusiastic when she gave her lectures, but students were of mixed opinions as to how good they were because oftentimes her lectures weren't really planned out. Basically, if you didn't already know mostly what she was talking about, they weren't very useful and you just get lost, which I can totally
I totally
understand.
understand that. That sounds like a lot of my lectures in undergrad.
Yeah. So, like, one cute story I found was like one time she had a new idea for a way to solve a mathematical proof, but she wasn't able to work it out before her lecture. So during the class, she just started teaching it and tried to work out the new proof in front of her
Like in
students.
real time.
Yeah, in real time. And then halfway through, she realized it actually wasn't going to work out the way that she had thought it would. And so she threw down her piece of chalk, stomped on it, and yelled, "There, I'm forced to do it in a way I don't want to." And then she taught the class the normal, traditional mathematical proof perfectly.
Can you imagine being a student in that class and then you're just like desperately taking notes? You're just like writing as fast as you can, like your
Yeah.
hand is cramping, and then she's like, "Oh, this doesn't actually even work," and then starts over. I would lose my mind. Like
Yeah.
that would be like, I'm done.
Yeah, it's like scrap
Yeah.
the last, like, 45 minutes. That was all useless. That's actually all
I
wrong.
would
And they're like, "What?"
absolutely lose my mind if that was me as a student. I would be like, I'm done. We're trying again
Yeah.
tomorrow. I'm going home.
Yeah, absolutely. But if you could get on the same level as her, her lectures were actually transformative, and many of her students credit her for completely changing the way that they thought. She if you hadn't noticed, she also didn't really care about having good manners or seeming ladylike at all. Um, One example of this is she would stuff her handkerchief down the front of her blouse and pull it out and stuff it back in repeatedly, making her dress wrinkled and untidy, which students found really funny.
I
And
feel
she
like that
just
just feels like such a mild offense. But then, like in the early
I know.
20th century, they're like, you're pulling it out from here and you're wrinkling your dress. Like that just feels so funny. I feel like the archetype of a professor, male or female, is just this sort of crumpled person anyway. You know, like they're just like have like coffee on
Mhm.
their shirt. They're just like, trousers they wore
Yeah.
yesterday. Like it's like not this person who's like
Yeah.
perfectly kept. You know what I mean? Like, that's kind of the archetype of what you think of,
Yeah,
like, a
but since she's
professor.
a woman, it's like
Exactly.
she's supposed to be. Yeah.
Exactly.
But that's exactly what people would say. They would say, like, she would spill food on her dress because she was, like, talking while she ate and, like, gesticulating wildly, and so, like, food would fall onto her dress, and she would just kinda wipe it away and, like, not care that it left a stain, or it's like, "Whatever, who cares?" And then, like, I thought this was so funny. So, like, one time she was teaching and her hair was falling out of her clip, and 2 students really wanted to talk to her and tell her that her hair was falling out of her clip and she should maybe, like, go and tidy it up, but she was just too busy talking to some other students, and so they couldn't even get a word in to talk to her about her hair. She's just like, I can't do who cares about my hair? Who cares? Math, math,
Not
math."
important.
She was always ready to share new ideas and help her students. And she had a dedicated group of students called the Nerder Boys
Aw.
who would promote her. I know. It's like, that's so cute.
And she had her little brothers too, so I'm sure it was just like
Yeah, exactly. So her Nerder Boys would promote her wherever and however they could. And her math colleagues, who saw how brilliant she was, helped shine the spotlight on her by inviting her to lecture and share her work. So, throughout the 1920s and 30s, Noether really started making a name for herself. She was becoming a very prominent figure in mathematics and mentoring many young mathematicians during their PhDs, and they went on to make their own amazing breakthroughs. Um, and so it seemed like she had more or less broken through society's sexism. But now I unfortunately have to remind you that she is a very prominent Jewish person living in 1930s Germany.
I have a feeling this story doesn't have a happy ending.
Well, it's not in the way you would think, actually. So at first, Emmy doesn't really take the rise of the Nazis and the growing anti Semitism very seriously, but pretty soon it does start to affect her. In 1933, Hitler's administration passed a law for the restoration of professional civil service, which removed any Jewish person from having a government job. So Emmy was immediately let go from her position at the University of Göttingen, along with several other of her colleagues. But she wasn't really fazed by it, probably because, she had faced this all her life. And
Right. It didn't
sh
feel that different.
yeah, and she had gone through years of not having a steady job anyway, so she's like, "What else is
Right.
new?"
It's
You
like
know?
it was originally because she's a woman and now it's because she's Jewish, but probably to her it didn't really feel any different.
Exactly. Instead, she opened up the front room of her home and started teaching private lessons, even to the students who showed up at her house in Nazi uniforms. She basically just ignored it and taught them the same way as everyone else because she, quote, never doubted the brown shirt students' integrity.
Wow. Yeah.
So, yeah, you're interested in math? Come, learn. It doesn't matter what your politics are.
I mean, it probably makes sense from her perspective too, right? Is that she was faced with so much discrimination and she was, faced so many roadblocks that her perspective, she's like, why would I put roadblocks up for someone else to learn who really wants to?
Yeah. I still found it kind of incredible though that it's like you're teaching someone who is like clearly a Nazi or clearly align themselves with that way of thinking and is clearly against you, but you're able to put that aside and just be like, it doesn't matter.
Yeah.
But with the situation getting worse and worse in Germany, Emmy finally realized she had no choice but to leave the country. Many universities around the world were offering refuge to German scholars who might be targeted by the Nazi regime. So a grant was approved by the Rockefeller Foundation for Emmy to take a position at Bryn Mawr. So she immigrates to America and she starts her position at Bryn Mawr in late 1933. And these were some of her happiest and most fulfilling days, I think, because she was at a college for women.
Yeah.
And so she was respected and surrounded by support like she never had been before. And she was able to fully be herself and work on math.
Totally. I'm really glad this story didn't end the way I thought it was going to. So yes,
Yes.
she has a happy life and she's in America.
Yes. She was invited to give lectures at the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton, which is actually where Albert Einstein ended up because he
Oh,
also left
right.
Germany. But she noted that she did not feel welcome at Princeton at all, which was a quote unquote men's university. But unfortunately, just 18 months after she arrived in America, doctors found a tumor on Emmy's pelvis. And then when they went in to operate, they discovered that she also had an ovarian cyst the size of a large cantaloupe, as well as two smaller tumors on her
Oh
uterus.
my God.
Yeah. So she went under the knife, and 3 days after the operation, she appeared to recover normally, but on the fourth day, her temperature suddenly rose to 109 degrees Fahrenheit and she died. So physicians aren't really sure exactly what happened, but they do think she most likely succumbed to a viral infection of some
Yeah.
sort due to the operation.
That's unfortunate.
She was 53 when she died. Her friends and colleagues at Bryn Mawr held a small service for her. German mathematicians came out in force to pay her tribute, including Albert Einstein.
Wow.
He actually wrote an obituary for the New York Times in which he wrote, in the judgment of the most competent living mathematicians, Fräulein Noether was the most significant creative mathematical genius thus far produced since the higher education of women began.
That's amazing. And to for someone who is already really respected, like Einstein, to be able to say this about someone, it's like he's using his power to help lift her, which is amazing.
I was just like, for Einstein to say
Right.
that, like, amazing.
It's interesting too that she does seem like she had a pretty privileged life, which gave her the space to, I mean, she was a woman in the early 20th century, but she had a family who supported her and, they could have disowned her. They could have been like, you need to be a lady or you need to do all the things that ladies are supposed to do. But they supported her and allowed her to do this work
Yeah.
and believed that math was something important because of her dad's position. And so she was able to
Yeah.
take these risks. It's interesting that even though she had all these obstacles, that from this perspective, she was able to take these risks because of the privilege and the position she had. So that's also kind of an interesting way to think about it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that she fully took advantage of that.
Yeah.
But yeah, that is her story. And I actually found out that although many mathematicians and physicists know of her name because they know Noether's theorem because it's so fundamental, many people just kind of assume Noether was a man
Yeah.
because,
It feels like a
like
fair assumption given the landscape of math and physics, but that's amazing that it's a woman.
I really hope I did justice to her actual work and her actual theorem and what she's known for. I'm so sorry if I got it wrong. Please write in and tell us what I got wrong.
Yeah, not gonna lie, I definitely fell out of my depth even listening to that. So kudos to you for writing
Yeah.
that story and taking it on. I think you did a great job, and I really, really
Yeah.
liked your story.
This is all Rachel's fault, so you can thank her. Thank her for writing in. Yeah, yeah. It was a fun story, but I think for the next couple episodes, I'm gonna have to stick to something that I'm a little more familiar with.
Thanks for listening. If you have a suggestion for a story we should cover or thoughts you want to share about an episode, reach out to us at smartteapodcast.com. You can follow us on Instagram, at Twitter, at smartteapodcast, and listen to us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get podcasts. And leave us a rating or comment. It really helps us grow. New episodes are released every other Wednesday. See you next time.